Now, of course, if you don't fancy generating energy by building wind farms, how about by burning household rubbish? It's called energy from waste, and some think it's the answer to a number of tricky environmental problems. Firstly, it reduces the amount of rubbish that needs to go to landfill tips. And secondly, it means we don't have to rely quite so heavily on fossil fuels. Sounds great, doesn't it? Until you find out there's one planned near to where you live. And then, of course, it looks like a dirty, smelly health hazard. Well, Susanna Mendonça joins us now from the site of one of these proposed plants in Shropshire. Susanna, what's the plan there?
Well, Michael, what they want to do is they want to burn rubbish instead of putting it into landfill sites like the one you see behind me. It's not the prettiest site, is it? This is the Granville landfill site here near Telford. Now, of course, there are really tough EU targets at the moment on reducing landfill, and the company that runs this site says the answer here is to build an energy from waste incinerator on this bit of land here. Now, what that would do is it would burn rubbish which would otherwise go into the landfill site, and the energy that would be produced from that would be used to power those factories that you see over there. But people living here are not happy about it.
It's one of those subjects that really does get people all fired up. We need to get rid of rubbish, but when you talk about burning it, you don't always get a warm welcome from the neighbours.
Loony lefties trying to stop something again. We're absolutely not. We're parents, and we care about the fact that literally 35, 40 feet from the edge of my garden, I'm going to have lorries turning 24/7, 365.
This is Mission Control. Well, the local pub. They're telling me all about their plans to stop an incinerator from being built up the road.
They've not thought about where they're based and where they're situated. This incinerator is going to be based around children.
In other countries, they can be recycling 80% of their waste. And so that's the answer, really, that we reduce the waste that's going to landfill, not burn natural resources at the risk of our children's health.
Up here it's easy to see why they're concerned. That's Telford just over there, and this bit of land is where the incinerator would be built. Now, the people behind it say this is the perfect place for it, because if you look over here you can see they've already got a landfill site here and they have a recycling area.
Most of the waste is already coming here, so the environmental impact from the movement of waste would be minimal. It would be the second smallest energy from waste plant on the mainland UK. It's a very modest size, and it's only designed to take the residual waste from Telford and Wrekin after all the recycling has been taken into account. But we've got to do something with the residual waste. We can't continue to put that into landfill as well.
That's for sure, because a European Union directive says so. But how do you reduce landfill? Well, what the EU really wants is waste prevention, and if you can't do enough of that, it wants you to reuse the stuff or recycle it. We're all supposed to be recycling 50% of our waste by 2020. Telford and Wrekin Council already recycles 36%.
Council wishes to move away from landfill to have a more sustainable approach to dealing with it in the long term. And our strategy at that point was open, really, to looking at a range of different technologies and different suppliers.
So with that in view, how likely is it that this application will be given the go-ahead?
Well, that's not an easy question for me to answer at the present time. For one reason, we're dealing with a planning application, and it would be wrong for me to give an indication at this point one way or the other.
That may be so, but the fact that it's a possibility is adding fuel to the fire back here.
You see, an energy from waste plants, which is what's being proposed here in Telford, comes under the EU's fourth option for waste management, which is recovery. Now that means it doesn't just burn rubbish, it turns it into electricity. And with 62,000 tonnes of waste going through it every year, that'll generate enough electricity to power 3,500 homes.
But campaigners here aren't convinced that that's a good enough reason to build one, and they aren't the only ones. Earlier this year, people living near Four Ashes in South Staffordshire tried to stave off plans for a waste from energy plant there, and there's concern over plans in the pipeline for one in Shrewsbury. This plant's been operating in Tyseley for some years now, and the firm that wants to build a smaller one at Red Hill near Telford says these kinds of incinerators aren't dangerous.
I'd like to reassure people that these plants are safe. They're operating safely in many European countries, Scandinavia, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, safely for many years. Same in the UK. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that plants operated to this high standard will have an adverse effect on people's health.
But they aren't convinced. They're spreading the word at this garden centre in Priorslee. Not a bad spot to find supporters with green credentials.
It's definitely a worrying trend. There are planning applications, there are proposals for waste incinerators across the West Midlands as well as nationally. Once you've burnt the waste, you can't reuse it. What we're very much in favour of is far greater recycling.
He might have a point, but with the EU demanding a 35% reduction in landfill by 2020, burning waste for energy could become more of a temptation.
Well, that could be so, and the government, of course, has been making very positive noises about energy from waste. Just last week, Jane Ruddock, the climate change MP, said that it was certainly one of the solutions. Of course, not the only solution. Recycling is another solution that everybody's pushing for, and there's plenty of that going on here today at the Granville Landfill and Recycling Centre. Now, I'm joined today by Mark Pritchard, who's the MP for the Wrekin, and also Nina Gill, who's a West Midlands MEP. Now, Mark, I'll start with you. Now, you're opposing the plans for this incinerator here. But what we're talking about is one that would be the second smallest in the UK of its type. Is this just a case of NIMBYism?
Absolutely not. This site, I think, is completely inappropriate for an incinerator. It may be appropriate for the current use, but to expand it into a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week incinerator, where we'll see a lot more heavy goods vehicle traffic into the area, would also see an impact on local residents. There are a lot of homes around this site. There are also 3 schools in Muxton, Priorslee and Sheriff Hales, and I think people are very right, and they have every they can be completely legitimate in their concerns about possible emissions from this incinerator. But
wherever you're going to build these kinds of things, people will be living nearby. I mean, we saw earlier in the programme we were talking about wind farms and people saying they don't want them near their homes. You know, people are always going to say this, aren't they?
Well, people are entitled to their view, and in fact CETA, I think, are being slightly disingenuous. We've asked them for a public meeting, they refuse, they say they want to consult with local people, and yet they tend to be on the run, and I think people are absolutely right to voice their concerns. The prevailing winds are southwesterly on this site. That will have an impact on Sheriff Hales, on Muxton, and on other places around here, such as Priorslee. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 schools, and I think parents and residents and teachers, and indeed local councils, Sheriff Hales Parish Council have objected, Shifnal Town Council have objected, and I hope that Newport Town Council will soon object to these plans as well.
Nina Gill, the landfill targets, you know, they are quite strict. You know, what is the answer? We have to build them somewhere, don't we? These energy from waste sites.
Well, precisely, yes. I mean, let me just start by saying I'm no fan of incinerators, and what the European Union and European Parliament was trying to do was to say, in the first instance, what we have to do and what local councils have to do is to encourage people to recycle and reuse more. Of course, not every hazardous waste can be recycled. Not every kind of waste can be reused. So we do need to find suitable ways of disposing some kinds of waste. Now, you know, landfill sites have just as many hazardous health problems and environmental problems as what Mark has just outlined for an incinerator. You know, the landfill sites have impact on the soil, they can affect the groundwater, they let off methane, which affects the environment. So we have to make sure that what we are doing is that the public have full information, so they make an informed choice, and the local council...
But the health issue is one that people are very worried about. Obviously here near Telford people are worried about it, but there are other incinerator plans elsewhere, you know, where communities have been concerned about the potential impact on their families. So, you know, shouldn't we know exactly what all the risks are before we do this?
Absolutely. All that information has to be made public so that individuals understand it. But, you know, we have passed, again, European legislation which state you have to have an environmental impact study before you can have an incinerator. You also have to make sure that the pollution control aspects are dealt with.
But Mark, you disagree, do you?
Well, the fact is that CETA themselves said they will regulate emissions from the incinerator. Well, if there's nothing to regulate, then why regulate it? Clearly there will be emissions, and people are absolutely right to be concerned about that, and I'm glad that Telford and Wrekin Primary Care Trusts have agreed that a health impact assessment is required.
But can I just say, it's a Tory MEP who led this legislation through the Parliament, Caroline Jackson, who said that...
Sadly, we have to leave it there. Sadly, we have to leave it there. There are other plans in the pipeline for Warwickshire, for Worcestershire, so and certainly here the campaigners say this isn't the end of their protest. They're planning a song called the Incinerator Blues, so we'll be listening out for that one.